Good evening, comrades. Thank you for joining us for another session of the Communist Culture Club. Tonight, I'm very pleased to have with us Geoff Barr, and he is giving an introduction on the relationship between Karl Marx, William Morris, and E.P. Thompson. Thanks for joining us, Geoff.
You ready?
We're ready.
Right. Well, you can see what's on the screen. I think it is the first time that Oscar Wilde's been on this, but let's hope it's not the last. Now, can marriages be made for three? Oh God, that didn't work, did it? Maybe that one will be better. Burne-Jones, the pre-Raphaelite artist, of course, was a great friend of Morris's. Morris was furious when he accepted a baronetcy, but they continued even after that to be friends. Few words about Morris. Born rich, his father was a city slicker. He loathed his formal education. He went to Marlborough School, and the other kids were nice enough to have a riot in which, quite commendably, they beat up their teachers, but less commendably, they beat up various people in the town because they thought they were all peasants. And then he went to university at Oxford and hated that as well. But in Oxford, he met Burne-Jones and other friends, mostly from Birmingham, and they formed lifelong friendships around the sort of second wave of the pre-Raphaelite movement. Very tied up in the Oxford movement, which you may recall was a high church movement close to sort of Anglo-Catholicism. And it seems very conservative, but the thrust of these young people was to get away from the liberal individualism of the age. And they rather loved all this romantic medieval stuff. We'll come back to that. And of course, Morris, as we know, his name has come down as the designer and what he called the lesser arts. Now, the next great person of importance is Marx, of course. There he is. Oh, God, it's the wrong Marx. Marx, of course, brings the things that we're all about: revolution and an economic analysis, a grasp of alienation, and he means that we understand the world differently and we can never go back. Marx was remarkably knowledgeable about the arts. I know everybody's read a fair amount of Marx, probably more than me, and you see endless quotations from classical texts of various kinds, from the ancient Greeks to what were then contemporary novels. And it seems that a large part of his family's entertainment was not watching quiz shows on TV, but reading Shakespeare to each other. As far as Marx was concerned, alienation was about a loss of artistic production. The two were tied together. And of course, you've come across Adam Smith and his example of the division of labor, making pins. And of course, what Smith did and what pin making did was turned a reasonable job into something incredibly boring, incredibly monotonous. And of course, if you keep on a single narrow task endlessly, you will get industrial injuries, repetitive strain injuries, and the like. The other thing I wanted to say was about the base and superstructure model. This is a favored model. Marx certainly used it in his early writings, but how far does it take us? It takes us some way in that it separates out the traditional history in which everything is motivated by kings and other great men of history, with the odd great woman. And it tells us that it's society that matters, not these illustrious leaders. And that, but the problem in a way is a kind of danger of economic reductionism. And that economic reductionism suggests that it's all about the economy. And no, it ain't. It's about a lot of things, but not simply some kind of economic reductionism. The other thing I wanted to draw attention to was the thesis on Feuerbach, sometimes underestimated by Marxists. But the thesis on Feuerbach emphasized the self-action of the community, and of course, in particular, Marx is interested in the working class, but it's that self-action from below, and it's the focus on practice to move the world on, rather than Feuerbach and the young Hegelians' ideas of philosophy making the world go round. Oh, there's Karl again. What makes good art as far as Karl is concerned? And I think the core answer is truth. Honesty is central. Marx, as a young man, was quite knowledgeable. He was considering writing a book with Bruno Bauer on the history of Christian art, but it would probably have been one of his underread pieces of work if he'd ever done it. Of course, he fell out with Bauer and it never happened. Marx was not looking for political correctness. What he was looking for was honesty, and he liked art by conservative people who told the truth about the real world. He preferred the Greeks to the Christians, mainly because art was sensuous. It's about feeling, and he felt that Christian art was dead, formal, and that Greek art was not. Marx occasionally made remarks that said he hated Romanticism, and I think it's fair to say that the Romanticism he was drawing attention to was very largely groups like the Luxbroden, a group of artists who appear very similar to the pre-Raphaelites, but are earlier and German. And that group were profoundly reactionary. They went to Rome so that they could be closer to God. God lives there. And their pictures are just about unknown in Britain. I've not seen an art gallery with one of them in there, but they are in German art galleries. But they tied themselves politically to the Prussian state. Of course, Morris was part of the Romantic movement, and pre-Raphaelites all were, as we know. But Romanticism is a big bag. It's different in different countries. In Germany, it was overwhelmingly reactionary. In Britain, it was left-wing and right-wing. All sorts of people from various points of view claimed to be romantics. Shelley on the left, various people on the right. Beauty, I think. I think we can say Marx had no big theory of art. There was no great generalization which would tell us all we need to know. As I said, beauty for Marx is sensuous. It's about feeling as well as about logic and such like. It's also about self-creation. in producing a serious work of art, you both make the world and yourself. Through that work, you change both in that interaction. Morris worked with the older man, Ruskin, and Ruskin was the great art critic of the age, but he was much, much more. In The Stones of Venice, he wrote about alienation, about the way in which the medieval workman was not alienated from his product, that he worked on his own very largely with a group, of course, but he worked through a complete process. He didn't just put heads on pins or some other piffling job to be done infinitely long time. And later in Unto This Last, he dealt with the question of the way in which the worker is alienated from himself, from humanity, and of course from his labor. So Ruskin, although he never used the word alienation, essentially came to the same conclusion as Marx, but by a very different route. I used to play in Ruskin Park. Ruskin, like Morris, they were both practical men. Morris in particular was endlessly, ceaselessly working. He was a sort of workaholic's workaholic. He did say at one point that anybody who couldn't produce a fabric while writing a poem wasn't really up to very much. I must say it makes me a complete failure, since I would bugger up both. One of Morris's pictures. He had a go at being an artist and quickly decided it wasn't for him. There is a work of his in Tate Britain, but it's widely considered to not be very good. His romantics were radicals. They were the awkward squad. Even if they weren't marked out as left-wing, they were anti-individualism. Their medievalism was a way of attacking individualism, and this is the point that Thompson makes in his great work. Morality, sentimentality, unlike Engels in particular, Morris was quite happy with both. Oh, who's that? I think some comrades will recognize him. Morris by Thompson. Thompson produced 2 editions of his great tome. The first one is over 900 pages long, and it is bloody heavy. Very close to Stalinism, admiring words about Comrade Joe. By he was unfortunate. The book came out in 1955, and of course he left the Communist Party in 1956. He wrote a lot about various things, but in 1977, a new edition came out that was shorter and in many ways quite different. One of the things he offers is a very sound historical methodology. And I think that in particular, his attacks on Althusser drive him to demonstrate that methodology and the way that history works. And he looked at Morris, and what he saw was utopia. The confluence of 2 rivers. I never knew until I got into Morris that there was a river called the Windrush, but of course it flows into the Thames, and it's near Kelmscott, where Morris had his Oxfordshire retreat. Oh, I'm looking a bit bewildered. Morris, Thompson says that I'm writing the first edition of his Morris, although, as has been pointed out, he never showed public opposition to the Communist Party or its policies until 56, that he felt that he was a Morrisist as much as anything, that he was convinced by Morris, who was not a Marxist in the full sense, although Owen Holland has argued that he was very close to Marx and that his arguments, especially in the economic sphere, were very much taken by Marx. But where I will probably diverge from many people is whether there's a thing called Marxism. Oh, somebody wearing blinkers. Marxisms of any kind, and Marxism's the one we're concerned with, limit us to past beliefs and methodologies. Useful things are done. I come along every week and I hear incredibly useful pieces of work by various people, but I'm arguing that the blinkers narrow your field of vision. It's Karl again. What had Marxism done to Marx? Well, his endlessly restless mind, his endless reconsideration, reconfiguration, questioning himself, turned into a series of rather dogmatic assertions. In my youth, idiotic youth, I suppose, I joined the Young Communist League at 14, which was the youngest age you could join. And we did have what they called education classes, which prepared us in the most dogmatic versions of Marxism imaginable. So we got this restless mind, substitutionism in which the party is substituted for the class. Kautsky and Lenin agreed, as Lenin quoted heavily from Kautsky in What Is to Be Done, on the need for substitutionism. And of course, in Russia, Stakhanovitism, in which Marx suggesting a world without massive, excessive labor turns into a mad world of workaholics and alcoholics, actually, in Russia. But an interesting transformation. When Marx was asked about his motto, he said, doubt everything. But he's been converted into somebody in which you doubt nothing. Thompson, again, not looking very happy in his C&D days. He always referred to himself as a Marxist, but I have an increased feeling as I read his work that it just doesn't fit the model. His work post-56, that is. He had the ability to produce the empirical study, the fine detail, without losing sight of the bigger picture. And in that way, he was a remarkable historian. And he emphasized that ideas don't float around. They exist in human beings faced with dilemmas at work and working their way through those dilemmas. And that's how ideas develop, including Marx's. Oh, there's Karl and Fred. Engels really didn't think much of Morris. Morris, Bax, and I've forgotten who the other one was, Aveling, went to see Engels, and afterwards he wrote, what use are these people? An artist and a philosopher and a scientist. he really didn't think much. Whoops. Morris is always these days considered a utopian, but not the sort of utopian that Engels was dealing with in Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. The older utopians were building up models of how society has worked. I guess a lot of people have read News from Nowhere. It doesn't do that. It's presented in the literary device of a dream, but it's very loose. It says very little about how societies run, except that a great deal of it looks like bloody hard work in the open air, which I can't say I find that congenial personally. Morris didn't do that, nor the Bolshevik Alexander Bogdanov in his novel about the future of communism, Red Star, which again is an interesting read. Romantics and Marx agree that society is essentially organic. It is a body of social networks that are not reducible to individuals or to a web of social contracts online with John Locke and other writers. So that Marx is thinking in a very different way from the individualists or from Engels' rather tendency to a sort of natural science reductionism. Well, you've had some art, so I thought now you could have some kitsch. For Morris, work should be like producing a work of art. It should be fun. It's a bit of a shock from our workaholic friends. And the trouble with many of us is that we can argue that being a workaholic is a bad idea and proceed to be workaholics. For most people, art and work are different. In fact, they're usually opposites. You work, you're alienated, you hate the buggers who make you do it, and you go off and enjoy arts and culture for fun. Of course, art can be alienating. I vaguely know a novelist, as soon as her first work was accepted, they said, we'll accept it on the basis you'll do a second one within this period of time. And each time she's now on a treadmill churning out novels, ridiculously rich, but churning out novels, presumably without that love that came from the first. That's where we're going. Marx versus Marxism has been a kind of sub-theme of a lot of left-wing literature. The new utopianism, oh, excuse me, of Morris is something that we ought to value. We need a bit of optimism. I think so much on the left has been so pessimistic. It's not about building a society as propping up the remnants of the left-wing bits that are left in this wretched capitalist system that we're stuck with. And I'm sick to death of being part of a left, which I often am, cheering and shouting with the rest of them, defending the status quo. Save thee, defend thee. It could be National Health Service or anything else. But we're not about clinging on to a dead status quo. We're about social change, and that means revolution. And I think for much of the left, that's been lost. Well, there we are. I've done my bit. It's now up to you, and I have the great advantage that I can get rid of my show. I've ended it. I've pushed it out the way. I seem to have sundry other things on my screen that it would be better if they weren't there.
Thank you, comrade. Well done. If you could press the stop share button.
Yeah. You're asking me for high-tech stuff, you know.
I'm sure you'll manage. I'm not sure I can.
That's not what I was looking for at all. Here we are.
We've done it. Brilliant. Thank you very much,
I
comrade.
seem to have stopped share.
Yes, I managed to find the button of how to do it.
You're quicker than me then.
Very interesting. Thank you very much for very entertaining sets of slides as well. I certainly agree with your assessment that there's something wrong with isms generally when you put it into a dogma. It becomes a dogma. I do call myself a Marxist as well, but I think what we can learn from Marx, and I think we probably most of us agree on that, is that it's a method, isn't it? It's a method of historical materialism, looking at things, trying to work out how they develop, how they've worked, etc. But if it comes to you need to believe in A, B, C, D, then certainly you are, I think, doing the opposite of what Marx and Engels tried to do. I question everything, not you?
Yeah, you're getting quite close to me. We probably disagree somewhat. I mean, I was just reading about the considerable differences between Marx's method and that of Engels, and I think that's quite interesting. Pete Kennedy says Marx hardly used these terms, or later Marxists did. A lot of it came in via Engels. Marx was very reluctant to build any kind of system, and I think that's where so much has gone wrong. One of my interests in Morris was, how do you get behind Lenin and Leninism and that whole culture that we on the left were brought up with? And I thought, in many ways, going back to before Lenin was of great interest. I'm just looking through.
There's actually Peter has raised his hand to speak. We can
great.
bring him in first and see what comments he has. Hi, Peter.
Hi there. Thanks, Geoff. Yeah, I think your talk tonight and just the build up to it got me reading around Morris again, and after like decades and I think like you're right in a lot of respects that Marxists, do need to kind of appraise what Morris was saying in terms of labour and art and alienation. I think in the figure of Morris, in practice, the way he lived his life was something like what Marx was talking about in terms of like the communist individual. He had the wherewithal, the position in life. He's very fortunate to be able to kind of live a life where he was better educated and so forth, and could open his mind and ideas to art and craft and then later politics as well. So when Marx records that brief statement about the man or woman in communism, then I suppose like Morris is living that life, and so that makes him more alert in a way. The standpointism of like just the degraded way that other people live their lives, and so I think it's been nice just to go back to that. I think like your point about Thompson is an interesting one, because I didn't know that he'd written about Morris, but what I picked up on is that he did, as you mentioned, he reproduced the work from his original 55 to the mid-70s or something. He revised it again, and that was like his own political trajectory. So I'm wondering at that time whether, because I haven't read Thompson and the Making of the English Working Class and his ideas on St. Monday, the way there was a struggle over the way people just didn't take to the discipline of a mechanized society and hark back to a previous generation, whether Thompson's ideas about the moral economy were kind of like fitting in and adapting with his maybe he's reflecting on Morris more, maybe he's moving away from the Stalinist kind of orthodoxy and beginning to think a bit harder about why we're fighting for socialism. It's not just for kind of creating a new machine. It's to kind of let loose the human potential, and that's what Morris stood for. So I thought that was interesting. I'm just thinking as well, and it is a question for you. Do you think in today's society, what important message do you think Morris had for us in today's society, particularly like with new technology, and the way that could be used in terms of labour and art and craft as well,
Very difficult to know, isn't it?
Yeah.
Very difficult to know what he did accept technology, but he thought that the machine should be the slave of the person, where what he was observing in Victorian England was workers as slaves of machines. And of course, he rather hated some of the byproducts. He hated train travel, although he used it a lot. And in that way, he was very ambivalent about it. When you read News from Nowhere, you're seeing a minimum of machinery in a rather idyllic setting. I mean, part of the idealism is that the weather's lovely all the way through, which one doesn't usually experience, but he has a web of relationships which work, of social relations. They don't solve all the problems of social and human relationships, but they remove the conflict. Interestingly, of course, at the very beginning, he starts off with his socialist meeting in London, and is a small group of people squabbling with each other. And it so reminded me of so many socialist meetings, I'm afraid. What would he have made of it? I think he would certainly have seen the enormous power of computing to transform the way we live. What would he have made of socialism? I think he would have been in despair at the fact that we're still a fairly small group, and if we add the various groups together that want to become some kind of new party, they don't amount to a huge amount. I'm quite in with that. I disagree with the idea of it being a Marxist party. I think it should be a revolutionary party, but I think that the problem of Marxism is considerable, that it ties you to a dogma, that once you have a leadership made up of that dogma, they have to defend the dogmatics, and it leaves you closed to the mass of young people who will come forward as the entire capitalist world treads on working people, as it is doing, and they'll come forward in a new way with new ideas, new thinking, and that we have to be open to that. I think where we stand is with an understanding that the working class will have no option but to transform society.
Do you think that Morris offers anything in terms of organizational insights into, making that a possibility?
Some, I did suggest some, I think. One of the other day, one of them is that they didn't expel everybody on the basis of minor tactical disagreements. In both the Social Democratic Federation, then the Socialist League and beyond, the fact that they had very different views from each other, Hyndman was always pro-imperialist. His England for All, in many ways, is a pretty disgraceful book. I don't know if comrades have read it. I'm not necessarily recommending it. The best chapters are simply plagiarisms of Marx and unstated. Marx was furious and never forgave him. but for much of the rest of it, he's supporting the empire. Morris and many of the others were firmly anti-imperialist. And Morris was endlessly anti-imperialist in just about all his writings. I went to a talk 2 years ago by a Morris expert who went through the mass of anti-imperialist material and arguments that Morris produced. Morris and most of the others were pro-women's suffrage and women's rights. Bax, another prominent member, was against. But they rubbed along together. They had ways of dealing with the disagreements. The history of the left sects, as you know, is that the moment you have a disagreement, you need a split. And you fragment. I was chatting to Tina earlier about my happy days in the WRP. Have you been in the WRP? You've not been lucky enough. Mad splits all the way through. This moment,
Morris split away, didn't he, and form the Socialist League from the.
Well, it became, but that was mainly over the horrors of Heineman's controlling. And Heineman was the most dubious character. He joined, having been in his earlier years a Tory. And of course, there was, I've forgotten the date of it, there was a notorious incident when the Social Democratic Federation accepted money from the Tories for an election campaign. The Tories were hoping that it would split the vote between the Liberals and the Social Democrats and let them in. I don't think it worked, but Heineman was an unprincipled leader, and it was much more of that than some policy issue that they simply found intolerable.
So from what I'm gathering then, that you know, obviously you're saying that Marxism is different from Marx. So are you then saying that if we just deal with Marx and we relate that to Morris, then there's more affinity between.
I think there's a lot more mileage in that. It's not the whole picture, obviously. It can't be the whole picture, but I think there's a lot more mileage in that relationship. The Socialist League, by the way, had a lot of disagreements. It included Marx's daughter and Aveling, who were very close to Engels, Morris, of course, but also a whole number of anarchists, Kropotkin and others. And they met regularly on a Sunday evening in Morris's London place in Hammersmith, which still has some Morris stuff in it. And they invited along the Fabian Society, anarchists, all sorts of people, and discussed and argued with them. And socialism was far more open then than it is now. It's got so closed down now.
Thank you, Peter. Geoff, I mean, E.P. Thompson wrote about Morris after he split from the CPGB, didn't he? Do you think he used him, he tried to use him as a sort of way to get at the sort of, you know, sect-like nature that the CPGB had become during the lack of democracy? Do you think that was a useful weapon? Did that work?
His first edition was while he was in the CP.
Right.
And then it took him a bit more than 20 years for the second. And the afterward, in the second edition, is a very useful assessment of what's changed. It's very similar to an article he wrote in New Left Review, virtually the same material, but it's a much more sophisticated analysis and assessment. He turned his back on the CP completely. I don't know how he got on with them in CND, where, of course, when the CP decided to join, you could call it peace washing, I suppose, that after the horrors of Stalinism and the declining forces of the CP, for a while it threw itself into CND.
I've got a few more people now in the chat who want to come in. So Ian, please.
Good morning, good evening, Geoff. Fantastic talk. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. I just wanted to ask a couple of questions and perhaps make a couple of little points. One is about utopianism and what we mean by utopianism. Because when we talk about utopianism, socialism, utopian and scientific, what seems to be at stake is a sort of a quest for socialism before its time. So we can think of something like Gerard Winstanley talking about the sin of private property in the 1640s. Here was a demand for socialism before there was a class capable of really delivering it. Utopianism in that sense. Utopianism, of course, from Moore's famous book, which is a fabulous read, by the way, which of course literally means nowhere. So, as it were, a kind of almost an impossible dream, but that isn't really what we mean, I don't think, when we talk about utopianism. The other thing I find interesting is I don't see anywhere in Marx any kind of appeal to tendentious art, art that bangs the drum, that somehow has to have a kind of finger prodding suggestion that this is volume 1 of Capital in told in the form of expressive dance or something.
Good idea.
Lovely. Next week.
I mean, I've sat through so many kind of utterly turgid, tendentious artworks, which are, well-meaning and really do try, but are kind of excruciating as well. And what you see in Marx is an appeal instead to the classics, and an appeal, therefore, to some of the most fundamental things in what it is to be human. And I certainly don't see any reference back to the past for nostalgic purposes in the way that Morris did. I mean, I've always seen Morris as politically radical but aesthetically conservative. Beautiful. I mean, it's lovely to look at, but it's a yearning for a bygone age, or a yearning for a future age that's a bit like the past. Simple, humble folk going about their business. And from that point of view, there's almost a sort of a whiff of Proudhonism about it. And a different type of substitutionism, in a sense, the artist substituting for the class. That somehow, if we all just liked beautiful things, that eventually, and it seems to also smack of that distinction between mental and manual labor, that the artist, as a mental laborer, as an intellectual, can lead the way. And that seems really quite different to the liberation of the working classes, the act of the workers themselves. And from that point of view, as much as I admire Morris as a political figure, and as much as I find his work aesthetically pleasing to the eye, I can't see it as a radical expression of a yearning for a better world in the future. And this is in quite sharp distinction to some of the kind of really radical stuff of the early part of the 20th century. And I'm not here just talking about things that happened in the Soviet Union. When you listen to Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, you feel a real surge of the passionate desire for another world. So that was that thing. What was that? Oh, I just wanted to mention as a little footnote to Oscar Wilde, of course. I'd recommend to anybody that they read Oscar Wilde's short essay, The Soul of Man Under Socialism. Of course, but Wilde, as you've already alluded to, it was actually influenced by Peter Kropotkin. So, and in a way, The Soul of Man Under Socialism was written in part as a kind of, because he also used to rub shoulders with George Bernard Shaw, the thoroughgoing state socialist that he was. And from that point of view, I prefer Wilde over George Bernard Shaw any day of the week. and of course you see the anarchist influence in Wilde in his short but hardly ever performed play Vera. Vera or the Nihilists, or the Nihilists or Vera or something, which was actually inspired by the life of Vera Zasulich, who was, of course, a correspondent of Marx. Yeah, that was, I think, everything I wanted to say. Thank you very much, but lovely and just fabulous to see you speak more often. For goodness sake, Geoff.
Thanks, Ian. Interesting points. Geoff, do you want to reply straight away?
Few comments. Marx was interested in good art. Lassalle wrote a play and sent it to Marx, and Marx kept on being very ambivalent about it for the simple reason he thought it was crap, but he wanted some of Lassalle's money. So he was most tactful in dismissing the fact that the play was absolutely dire, and I've never heard of it being performed. Morris was at the cutting edge in his day. Remember that the pre-Raphaelites were chucked out of the Royal Academy. They called Sir Joshua Reynolds, the founder, Sir Sloshua, because they didn't think he was very good at it. And rather like the Impressionists, they'd moved from the way out rebels, what the hell are these people doing, to the chocolate box. So, yeah, he was in his day quite radical, but he was also running a business. Although he'd given up religion, he first thought he would become a priest, but he gave that up at Oxford. But he continued to do, with Burne-Jones, design glass windows and things for churches, for other buildings. He was making a living as a successful businessman while he was running a revolutionary party, and almost any organization he joined immediately made him treasurer because he had the money. And he funded these organizations. They all ran at a loss, as we're aware that socialist organizations tend to do that. No, Morris was very much a man of socialism from below. Very much. That's quite misleading. He wanted a mass working class movement. He worked for it. He got out on the street corner making speeches in freezing cold weather. One of the things he was most concerned about was the perils of parliamentary socialism. And that's why he took a strongly abstentionist position. Don't vote. It only encourages them. He had problems with it, and we still do. I mean, one of the problems he drew attention to was that you can get half a loaf instead of the whole thing. So you get your National Health Service with some socialistic elements in it, but that's about it. Mental and manual labour. Morris did give lectures on the need to draw together what you might call the high arts and what he called the lesser arts, the things he was engaged in: design, patterns, fabrics, wall hangings, that kind of thing. So he was very much engaged in drawing the two together, and he did it himself. When he didn't like modern chemical dyes, he went off to the Midlands to a company to learn how to use natural dyes. So he was very much hands-on in that way, in a way that Marx wasn't. And when he talked about alienation, he gave, in a way, a more vivid perspective, because he knew what work was about, what physical labor was about, and did it. He was also a pioneer in defending rights. He severely embarrassed the establishment by being nicked on a demonstration and they had to haul him up before the courts. And he was one of those people who was very much to the forefront in establishing the right to demonstrate. What would he do now? Well, I'm sure he'd be defending those people who've been locked away for Extinction Rebellion and those sorts of things, because he was very much a defender of the right to demonstrate, the right to protest. And he was willing to put his body in there as a man who became a socialist in his 40s, not a spring chicken.
Interesting. But do you think his socialism was sort of the future, or some people sort of, say that he wanted to go back, the sort of taking machines away again and doing things by hand? That's a better way of socialism, or was he able to look ahead?
No, like I said, his aim with machinery was to see that the machine was the servant of the user, not the other way around, which of course was the rule and still is for lots of us, that we're slave. We forget most of these people here are either retired or have middle-class jobs, but standing on a production line, slaving away, you are the servant of the machine. And Morris was strongly against that. There was a rather sentimental element to his thinking, but as he said in The Dream of John Bull, one of the surprising things is that you fight for something, you win it, you then discover that it's something else entirely, and you've got to fight for it again. And I think probably things like the National Health Service are models of that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Christine, hi.
Hello, hi Geoff. Thank you very much. That was wonderful. When I congratulated you on this forthcoming talk, you replied to me, "Thanks, I'm concerned that I take a very different view from most of them," meaning this group. It could be lively. So my question would be, what is so contentious about what you're saying? Because everybody's been very interested in what you're saying and enjoyed it. So that's my question. But I've also got a suggestion that's linked to another group that we often are attending, where a group of communists are wanting to get the whole of the working class together to overturn capitalism, which I agree with. That would be good. That would be good for everybody and for the planet. But they're also terribly hostile and critical, as you mentioned, Morris was, of the reformists who want to improve capitalism through parliamentary means and campaigning. But my suggestion is that if we look at Morris and his aims, we can actually look ahead to what I would say is a part-time utopia or anarchy, because we've all of us got some leisure. We're not all sort of noses to the grindstone. We've got time. We can practice arts and crafts. One of the things that I think is particularly important is that we can also garden. I don't know that Morris was particularly interested in that, but I see it as a kind of sidelining of capitalism. Kind of push it on one side and say, no, we don't like that. Let's do all we can that's not capitalism. So things like, and has been mentioned on the other group, food banks. They condemn it and say, well, surely in a rich country we shouldn't have to have food banks. Well, sure, that's true, but surely it's an example of our humanity, and that's something that we can be brought out if we look at Marx and his particular type of utopia and anarchy. Because anarchy is very much part of it. There were no schools, for example. People just learnt by looking at what the grown-ups were doing and having fun, picking up and doing bits and pieces of what they were doing. The freedom of it was wonderful. So I think there is space in the awful world that we're living in, which is so ghastly, to escape into as far as possible, following the sort of ideas that Morris had, and also the romanticism. I mean, for me, the news is so ghastly, particularly since Trump, that I've disappeared into Lord of the Rings, which I'm rereading for the umpteenth time, because anything to get away from the awfulness of the world as it's playing out at the moment, particularly all the wars. Thank you.
Right.
Christine.
I think there's a lot in there. It's time you did a talk, by the way, Chris. You're hiding your light. The alternatives, I mean, of course, the earliest ones were the cooperative movement. And you built your own system at first of distribution. And when capitalists boycotted you, you ended up going into production and all of the other phases. In Britain, I mean, in other countries, cooperatives were often production cooperatives. But what happened, of course, is that they simply got swallowed up as part of the capitalist system. And the problem is not that those things are bad things, they're very good things, but that in the end, we have to break the power of capital and of its state. Without that, we have nothing that can be permanent. And I think that's the problem that Marx and Morris agreed on. On education, by the way, Marx and Morris are remarkably similar. When you read the critique of the Gotha program and Marx's ideas on education, Morris's ideas on education, he's called his schools boy farms. And of course, over COVID, we discovered something like that. He hated them and he thought kids could learn with adults as they go along. He didn't have, he hated the idea of schools and the formality of schools. And of course, these days, the obsession with examinations and measurement would have given him the utter horrors. So, yeah, your turn, Chris.
Yes, we're always looking for people to make suggestions about subjects they're interested in. Chris, please feel free to make a suggestion. Not now, maybe, but get in touch. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
Bob, I think, was next. Are you there? If he's just popped out, I'll take Steve first.
Yeah, thank you, Geoff. I know very little actually about William Morris, so that's quite interesting. But coincidentally, I've just started rereading this, but I don't know if you can see it on because it's The Poverty of Theory.
Yeah.
E.P. Thompson, and I was reading this
Brilliant
first essay in there, which is The Peculiarities of the English, which is about his polemic with Tom Nairn and Perry Anderson. So I was just coincidentally reading it. So I think we are talking about three major figures in English socialism. And I say English mainly my meaning, of course, not that they confine themselves to England, but they all worked and lived here in England. And you're right to think of there being, we're talking, I've got one main point, which I'll come on to in a second, really, but I think maybe complements one of the things you said. But we have those three trends: bureaucratic, anarchistic, and democratic. Now, you gave the example of bureaucratic, I think, in Bernard Shaw, socialism from above, as it's sometimes called. And I guess William Morris probably slots into the socialism from below in more anarchistic, libertarian sense. And there's the other tradition, the third tradition, of course, is the democratic tradition that puts its emphasis on democracy, not anti-bureaucratic and anti-anarchist in its approach. Now, I do agree with you on one of the things that you said, the isms, that you started speaking about the isms, but some isms are fine, it seems to me. Fascism is one that works okay. Reformism is one that works okay. But I think the problem is when you name or attach to one person a whole set of ideas, you begin to make an ideology or a kind of dogmatism or even a culture of the great man or woman. We can think of Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism, Trotskyism. I don't know if there's a Barrism, probably not.
Let's hope not.
No, let's hope not. A workmanism. I don't know whether you got one of those yet, or you know, who knows? A Davisism maybe, or a Spencerism. I don't know. But anyway, I think there's a fundamental problem in doing that, and that it leads you down a dogmatic pathway. I think the word communism fits the bill because it clearly doesn't attach itself to any one person, but it sets an alternative, a clear alternative to capitalism. It stands at the opposite pole to capitalism. So if the aim is communism as an alternative to capitalism, so I would much prefer to use the word communist. And of course, that's not to deny that Marx, Lenin, Trotsky, all of these famous revolutionaries, if you like, made a great contribution to communism and communist ideas. I realize that if you've got a word like Trotskyism, it attaches you to a particular set of theories, like the Fourth International, the transitional powers. So I don't guess we can get away from these personal isms, but I think as a general principle, we should try whenever we can to steer clear of them, because I think it leads you into a kind of dogmatic sort of direction. So communism is the aim, and that's the term that everybody should be flying under, you know. And I'd leave. Oh, just one other little point. Yeah. Heinemann, of course, as you mentioned, he was an anti-Semite. I mean, only a Tory, started out as a Tory, but I think he was an anti-Semite. And he was a monarchist as well as an imperialist. So he had some very reactionary politics, as you've already said, Geoff. Let's finish there, Tina.
Thanks, Steve. Did you want to say something, Geoff, or shall we bring some
Shall
more?
I hang on for a bit and give other people a chance?
Okay, Bob was next. Hi.
Yeah, thanks, Geoff. Nice little talk. I quite like that. Just a few points. You started off very early talking about romanticism. And I've often, not always, I've often associated romanticism with utopian socialism. And I think Ian's already spoke of Oscar Wilde's book, which I do like myself, The Soul Man and the Socialism. I mean, it was a long time ago when I read it. And, you know, he was, I think one of his main messages in that was about, you know, people, not necessarily workers. People are better off collectively looking after each other and caring for each other. And it came, I mean, clearly he was a thinker about how the world should be, how the planet should be organized. But I just found his conclusions in the 1880s, 1890s, I can't remember when it was written, quite sentimental. And I also think that of William Morris as well. Again, news from nowhere. I mean, as you said, Geoff, I mean, he wakes up, doesn't he? He falls asleep, he wakes up. And I think he wakes up to this world where there's no private property, no authority, and no money. And I think you've got this fusion of this utopian socialism where there's some sort of, like, I don't know, an enchanted view of the future. And I think that utopianism, I suppose, that, you know, the likes of Wilde and the likes of Morris had, you know, it does contrast with my idea of socialism, my idea of socialism underpinned by a science and, you know, a program around a scientific socialism, something that's evaluated, something that's critiqued, something that's tested, something that's put in action, you know, as you said, a method. And you said something about, I've got a problem with calling a party a Marxist party, but not a revolutionary party, because a Marxist party would tend to lead it into dogma. You need to explain why you think that's the case, because I don't necessarily agree with you. If you're talking about the need for a revolutionary party, then what is that party based on? I mean, it must have an ideology. You know, is it based on anarchism? Steve mentioned the question about communism. Okay, but you know, obviously, as part of a communist party, you're going to have Marxism within it, and I don't necessarily see that as being dogmatic. You know, we need to win people. You can't force people to like Marxism. You have the ideas. I think we have the history behind us on that to win people to that position. But I don't think you can force people into that position. And that's why I was a little bit clearly when you talked about getting trapped in a dogma around Marxism. And I don't think that is the case.
Thanks, Bob. I mean, there's enough dogma associated with the word communist, isn't it? I think it's up to us to clear those words from those dogmas and perhaps say that actually communism, Marxism, you know, they are about freedom and free speech and having allowing differences and exploring things without dogma. What do you think about that point, Geoff?
A couple of things, yeah. Steve's points, I think, of course, democracy, which in its original sense, democracy as a form of rule and demos as the people. And that's what socialism from below is about. The point about scientific socialism, one Marxian writer talked about the problem in social science is having a thing called physics envy. The belief that we can somehow have a social science that imitates natural science and that that's a good thing. And I think it ain't ever going to happen. The obvious reason that people are aware of is that the objects of study in physics have no consciousness. We do. So as we study, as we report our studies about people, they change as a result of our studies. You can never have that kind of precision that you could have with a natural science. It's just not possible, and it's not desirable. This is up to a future that people in the future make for themselves. And we can't lay down how they do it. We've got a few general ideas about how it might work. Marx, of course, was opposed to ideology of any kind. This, as far as I can see, I may be wrong, but it seems to creep in with Lenin. What Marx is trying to do is to study the real world by, if you like, a two-stage process. One stage is an examination of the methodology of the categories, and of course his transformation in capital of the economic categories of bourgeois economics. And the second is an empirical study of how things really are. I'm studying as well Marx writing about the Turkish Empire. One of the things he says to Engels is, I'm not going to write anything about the government of it because I don't know anything about it. He doesn't have a magic key. And one of the roles of ideology is to provide that magic key. And I think it is a part of a kind of sectarianism. If you set it up on the basis of an ideology, you invite everybody in, you say, you don't have to believe. You have to believe in our policies, not our ideologies, and you have the best of intentions. But as soon as they begin to take part in the leadership and they start saying, well, this isn't Marxism, we want something else, possibly something new, the Marxists have to preserve the Marxist nature of the party. And they immediately have to circle the wagons. And it's a part of the road to sectarianism. What we have to be open to is those millions of people who are going to be even more desperate. I mean, so far in Britain, the strategy has been pretty straightforward. You bash the workers, you bash the unemployed, and you buy off the pensioners. Whoopee for me. But now they're going for the pensioners. It seems that they will all agree that the triple lock disappears. Having impoverished the rest, they'll now impoverish us. Trump will impoverish Americans pretty quickly. This is not going to go without a fight. But what's the nature of that fight? Is it around Deform or whatever that party is called? Or is it around a socialist party offering, or socialist communist offering revolutionary conclusions? It sure ain't going to be reformist conclusions, because we've tried them, and we tried, and Corbyn frankly tested them to destruction.
And they're still trying. Collective will be launched as a party, maybe.
Yeah, they're very trying.
I don't know how many times you have to fail at the same thing. Thank you. Steve, please.
Are you calling me?
Sorry?
Are you calling on me?
Which Steve?
Sorry, you. Yes,
Steve.
sorry, you, Steve Lee. Sorry.
Okay, sorry. Sorry. Yeah, thanks everybody. Interesting discussion. I think the stuff about William Morris is very interesting. I love the biography and so forth. But I think the characterization of Marxism is by Geoff is really off base. The question, Marx was not the famous saying, philosophers only interpret the world. The point, however, is to change it. Marx started as a philosopher, became a political organizer, economist, and activist. He wanted to change the world. That was the key thing. And he drew conclusions from that. Marxism is not just a method. It's like science. There's a scientific method. But there have been conclusions that have been drawn from science, which should not be just thrown out willy-nilly, right? Doesn't mean they can't be reevaluated and rethought and restudied and all that, but they can't be just thrown out. In the same way, Marxism, I believe, is a science, and the conclusions that was reached by the study of history may be modified from time to time, but they can't just be thrown out. What matters is action and organization around particular principles, and the idea that you can have a party with fundamentally different ideas, conflicting ideas, I don't think works. For example, you can't have an effective party that has imperialists in it and anti-imperialists, like Hyman and Morris. If you do, you're confusing your image, your impact that you have. People don't know where you stand. You can't move in a certain direction. So you need to have clear principles. So I think it's not just enough to say revolution. The point is what has worked in previous revolutions and what has not. In my view, the lack of a revolutionary socialist party that can lead a revolution is the main thing that has defeated revolutions in the past. And what we need is to have clear politics and clear organization and direction that's rooted in large numbers of people. That's what we should be aiming at, not at some kind of eclectic stew of different ideas, because which ideas you follow will determine victory or defeat in various circumstances. So we need to learn from the history. And as far as calling it Marxism, I think it's accurate to call it Marxism, but if you want to call it communism, that's fine, or whatever. But the point is to have those clear sets of ideas, and that means sometimes you do have to have splits. As before World War I, the socialist movement split between pro-war and anti-war. Those kind of things were absolutely necessary, and I think are necessary today. You can't contain within the same party fundamentally opposite class viewpoints, which is really what it comes down to. So I think we rehabilitate Marxism as an active approach and not just a method. Thanks.
Thank you. We are going to discuss, of course, all these ideas about how to build a communist party from next week. We're starting a new series exactly on that. But I would like to know what you think about that as well, Geoff.
Well, I think Steve's expressed the point of view which I quite deeply disagree with. Yes, we work towards a science, but it's a very different science from natural science, and we have to recognize that. But science is open. You don't know until you've investigated. And Marx's point was to get away from an ideology which could be expressed as an ism. Parties, of course, have to have some bounds. If you're like the Democrats in America and anyone can join, you're not really a party, even though you may describe yourself as such. But where are those bounds? What are the limits? And the left sects, the SWP, the old WRP, the Socialist Party, and I mean, Tina's got her finger more on the pulse than me. She can probably name 10 others. They have their bounds in a very rigid structure, which strangles any possibility of development. Because as soon as you start developing, you split. Because the new people come in with new ideas and they're a threat to the old leaders who have to get rid of them. Marx was very well aware of this. Marx's writings on the party are looking to something much more open than he denounces the sects, and so does Engels. And that's a real problem. And in many ways, these early socialist movements I'm talking about had the characteristic of sects. They were very small in number, very closed in. They all knew each other. And we have to get beyond that. And they were aware of that. No, I don't look to a democratic centralist party. I look to a much more open movement. And I think that fascinating book, The Other Bolsheviks, points to the diversity until the revolution within the Bolshevik party. I pointed to Bogdanov, who never was anything like a Leninist or an orthodox Marxist. He's considered these days as the father of systems theory, quite a different approach. Not much of his work is translated into English, unfortunately, but we need that kind of variety. And in fact, Bogdanov was one of the leaders of the Bolsheviks in Russia, rather probably had more support in Russia than Lenin did, who was in Western Europe. So, yeah, I'm looking to a much broader approach. Yeah, of course, it has to have limits. My experience of the WRP, the people who broke away first were the people around Alan Thornett. Well, why? Because he was a serious leader of an industrial bloc. He had the strength with which to oppose the appalling Jerry Healey. He wasn't very good at his opposition to Jerry Healey, in my experience. I went to many meetings with him. The militant group broke up over their enormous success over the poll tax. That was not accidental. That campaign over the poll tax gave members new confidence and new drive. And unless you can encompass that, you break.
This is, of course, the key question of our time. You know, with the world, everything is going to the right. And what are the left doing? What's the working class doing? F all at the moment. We're not organized at all. How do we form into a party that can take on capitalism and doesn't just, you know, fiddle around on the edges and talks nonsense like the Corbyn party will do again and talks about justice and peace and stuff. We actually need to get to the bottom of how to overthrow the capitalist system. We might disagree, Geoff. I think I'm sure we'll discuss this further in the forthcoming series on what democratic centralism is. I think you have in mind something quite horrible when you hear the word democratic centralism, quite, you know, a sect, and you have to always do what the leadership wants. I think that's probably, there's different ways of doing this. In my mind, democratic centralism, real democratic centralism, has the, you know, the emphasis on the democracy. You can have a wide-ranging debate. You can discuss issues. You can have minorities. You can have factions, etc. When there's a specific action, you expect comrades to, you know, all the members of the party to go with the action. But before and after, which is the vast majority of the time, debate things out. And I think that's a very good way of trying to win the mass of the working class to your party, which has to be democratic, doesn't it? It has to have principles, but you can't accept that everybody just agrees with everything. That's the death of anything, isn't it? If you force people to agree and shut up, basically, or keep it inside, you're not allowed to write about it in the paper. That's the end of building any kind of mass communist party. I think the free speech bit, the debate bit, has to be the one that we're emphasizing. But occasionally, when there is an action, when there is something important, you'll have to act as one. Is that how you understand democratic centralism, or do you have a different interpretation?
I think that's probably subject to a later debate, isn't it?
Kinda, yeah, but
I think the phrase has resonance, it has history, and I note that all the Trotskyist groups have democratic centralism, which means something pretty awful.
Yeah.
Voting with the recommended list to get your leaders is a good
bureaucratic
one.
centralism, I'd call it, rather than democratic.
Maybe we should come back to that on another occasion.
Yes, probably. It's just we had nobody else with a hand up, so I thought
right.
it. But
well, if we finish, we go to an early dinner.
Okay, let's have an early dinner. But I hope you join us for the next session, which starts next Thursday. And this is sort of accompanying the fusion process that is going on at the moment on the British communist left, but it is not part of it, I should stress. We are interested in the process, we're accompanying it, and we'll have speakers from the groups involved, and hopefully other people who are not in those groups are also interested in this process, which I think is the most positive thing that happened on the British left for many, many years. And we'll be discussing exactly those issues. How can we get together, even though there might be differences on this and that, and how do we resolve those issues? So I'm looking very much forward to it. Starts next week, 6:30 on Thursday. Geoff, thank you very much for a brilliant session. You're doing another one for us very soon on Marx and War.
In about a month and a bit.
Yes, we'll finalize the timetable. But thank you very much for tonight's session. Very much enjoyed it. Thank you, comrades, for coming along, and good questions from the floor. See you next week.